This is Barracoon, the story of the last slave. It was written by Zora Neale Hurston. This book is based on the emotional story of Oluwale Kosola or Cudjo Lewis, who was one of the last known survivors of the last slave ship, Clotilda, that transported enslaved Africans to the US in 1860. The author, Zora Neale Hurston, held a series of interviews with him in the late 1920s, and these conversations form the basis of this book. Kosola was born around 1841 in a Yoruba-speaking town which existed in part of the territory of Benin Republic in modern times. At age 19, he was undergoing initiation rites for marriage when disaster struck. But before that, let's cycle some years back. Back in 1807, the transatlantic slave trade had been outlawed by the British and followed by the US in 1808. In reality though, many Africans were still being shipped across the Atlantic in spite of this ban. So in 1860, three pro-slavery Americans named the Meyer brothers alongside one Captain William Foster in defiance of constitutional law built the Clotilda and sailed for Ouidah, the slave port of Dahomey, managing to survive storms and anti-slavery naval squads patrolling the waters by bribing some of the Portuguese officials whom they came across. Glele, the king of Dahomey, had sacked Kosola's town on the pretext of having been insulted when the king of Banter refused to yield to his demand for corn and cattle. In Kosola's description of this raid, he told the author of how the Dahomey female warriors slaughtered people in their days, while the male warriors surrounded the 8 gates that entered into the city and beheaded those who tried to escape. The survivors of this massacre were yoked in foxsticks and chains and marched to incarceration in the Barracoons of Ouidah, from whence the journey of no return would commence. Kosola and over 100 others were sold to the wily Captain Foster, who then loaded them on board the Clotilda and set sail for the land of the free and home of the brave. You see the irony? Once he had brought his cargo to Alabama in the US, the ship was destroyed in order to conceal the evidence. The Africans were secretly sold to different owners who put them to work as slaves. The Meyer brothers were tried between 1860 and 1861 and fined heavily, but that did not change the status of Kosola. He remained in slavery till the end of American Civil War. Kosola, or Cudjo, as he was known by the slave master, narrates stories about his home country, how justice was usually meted to murderers. In one instance, he talked about someone who was charged with murder being brought before the town council where the king presided. And once the sentence was issued, the accused was seized by an executioner who wrapped him, that is the accused, to the body of the dead person that was murdered. He will be left in this manner till he died, with no one paying attention to his cries for help. The implication of this was to demonstrate that by breaking the laws that tie society together, the accused was dead to the society, and as such, how can a dead man cry if the corpse which he was tied to isn't crying? A deeply philosophical view of the world, if you ask me. Something else I picked on was one of the subtle ways by which the white slavers justified their terrible actions. Listen to this text from Cudjo. "We tried to save our clothes. We ain't used to be without no clothes on. But they snatch all of us. They say you got plenty clothes where you going. Oh Lord, I so shame. We come in the America soil naked, and the people say we naked savage. They say we don't wear no clothes. They don't know the crew snatch our clothes away from us." So, by perpetrating those ideas of the Africans being lesser than human, that is, savages, these allowed the slavers to justify their inhumanity to these people, since, after all, they weren't human. That is, the Africans weren't human. Another sad part in this never-ending sad story was the disconnect that Cudjo and others experienced with other black folks, that's the Africans who were born in America. Being of the same color and status as slaves, he assumed a sense of kinship with them, albeit misplaced. In Cudjo's words, "We want to talk with the other colored folkses, but they don't know what we say. Some make fun at all." Describing another incident, he said, "So we dance like in the Africa soil. The American colored folks, they say we savage, and then they laugh at us, and don't come say nothing to us." On April 12, 1865, at the end of the Civil War, Cudjo and others were told that they were now free. They asked where they could go, and the soldiers told them they could go wherever they wanted. For context, these were people who were brought to a new world, knew no one, suddenly told that they were free. Question was, free to do what? No education? No money? Cudjo said, "We ain't got no house, so nobody tell us come sleepy in the section house. We done that till we could get ourselves some place to go. Cudjo don't care. He a free man then." What he was just saying essentially was that he never really cared. Whatever it was, at least he was not a free man, so every other thing should suit itself. But with no money, Cudjo and the other free African slaves decided to work and raise some money with which they could buy a ship and sail back to their home country. The cost of this endeavor was, however, too much, so they had to shelve the idea. They made a certain Gungpa their leader, who ironically was a subject of the Dahomey king who had invaded Cudjo's village, only for he himself to be handed over to Captain Foster, the slave buyer. The men worked themselves hard, saving as much as they could, and finally bought the land off the former slave owner, all paid in cash. There they built what became known as the First Africa Town, a community of freed African slaves who still had fresh memories of their homeland, which they desired to one day return to. But this hope faded away in time. So they settled. They built their own homes by themselves, relying on the old African communal spirit. They built their own school to educate their children, built their own church, and named it the Union Missionary Baptist Church. Cudjo was a man who was acquainted with many sorrows. He held within him dreams of Africa, desired to one day return to his homeland, which never came to fruition. He instead settled in the New World to build a life, and even then, his first daughter, who was born in 1878, took ill and died when she was only 15. So also his son, who was murdered in his youth. Another son was killed in a rail track accident in rather mysterious circumstances, while a third son fell ill and also died, and finally, his beloved wife died too. At the time of his death in 1934, he was survived by a daughter-in-law and 2 grandchildren. What makes Cudjo's story so powerful for me was the weight of history, long-buried memories which he was able to share. Even after decades of separation from his homeland, he carried within him dreams of returning to his beloved country in the Africa soil, as he fondly called it. He recounted stories of the customs of his people, the traditional marriage rites, the fact that being big was considered a sign of wealth. He had led a very difficult life. When the author finally met him, he said with tears in his eyes, "Thank you, Jesus. Somebody can't ask Cudjo, I won't tell somebody who I is. So maybe they go to the Africa soil someday and call him my name, and somebody there say, yeah, I know Kusola." He made sure he gave his children Yoruba names. His eldest was named Iyajemi, which means to say, I have suffered. Another was named Feyishiton, which roughly translates to someone who has lots of stories behind them. Anyway, this is the story of Cudjo Lewis. This is the story of the last slave.